Well, thank you very much for your welcome. One of the opportunities that Ian and I have, I said we live at Moorlands College. We live in a very small village called Sopley in Dorset. And when Ian isn't away preaching on a Sunday, we attend our local Anglican church. And you could fit our church several times. I should think it's probably about the size of the chancel here. It's a very small, very old church. And there's a small group of people. We are actually the youth group in the church. Very small group of people. But we've got a new priest in charge who's come, who's a lovely man, he and his wife. And we've seen some real growth because there's lots of couples who come to get married because it's a very picturesque church. And he's really working hard, not only in the marriage preparation, but in being able to keep those contacts with those couples. So instead of leaving when they get married, they've started to attend regularly. So we've actually seen a real growth in our congregation, and we are no longer the youth group. There are people who are younger than us. But it's a lovely church that we attend. But it's very similar to this in that we have some stained glass windows and lots of things that are up as memorial around. And I haven't had a chance to look at all of yours. But within our church, certainly when it comes to Remembrance Sunday in November, they list the names, and you can see the stones on the wall of the families who are from that village who have been affected because people died, whole families who died in the First and Second World War. And so that's what the title of what I'm going to share this morning is about. What do these stones mean when we are surrounded by things that commemorate, as in your church, events, special occasions that have happened, people maybe who have died at different times, and events through the church history. They bring back memories. Memories are not what they used to be, as they say. But I'm one of these people, and maybe there are others in the congregation, who love to clear out cupboards and lofts and things like that. We are a unique crowd of people. There's not many of us. My husband thinks we are peculiar. But there are times within our life where we have to do some clearing up. And there's some pictures that are going to come up of the next one about some treasures. A few years ago, about 15 years ago, we had to move from where we had lived for quite a long time, and our children had grown up through important parts of their teenage years, to France, where we were going to lead a church. And because everything that we took with us was going to be packed into boxes and was going to cost to be transported to our new house, it sharpens your mind somewhat about what you can take and what you can't take, and what is really important and what isn't important. And so I was in my element, as you can imagine, because of this weird thing that I have about clearing out cupboards. And I went up into the loft and decided that we needed to be able to clear the loft because the house was going to be passed on to the new minister, and he didn't want our rubbish. And actually found some treasures. And I found a whole load of toys. Now, I'm not doing an advert for them, but there were quite a few Fisher-Price toys which do last, I'm told, and they certainly have. And they were toys that I had kept from when my children, I've got 4 children who are all grown up, and I had kept them thinking one day I'll have grandchildren who can play with these. So I kept a whole box of toys, which included quite a lot of Fisher-Price things. But also there was a whole box of Star Wars things. And it was just at the time when Star Wars was coming round again, as these things do. And I was really excited, brought down this box, dusted a lot of the things down, and then gave them to my grandchildren who live near us, and I look after them. For 2 days a week, I childmind 3 of my grandchildren, the best job in the world. And I gave them this box, and it was like every Christmas had come together. They just were enthralled by it. I had a Millennium Falcon and lots of the figures that went with it as well. When Ian went and told the staff that we work with that we had found this box and given it to our grandchildren, one of the men was horrified and said, "You're not giving them to children to play with. They are worth hundreds of pounds. If they're in good condition, or if you've got any of the boxes, you could make a small fortune." And I thought, I don't want toys that I'm going to sell for money. I want to see my grandchildren playing with the toys that I saw my children playing with. So I found these amazing treasures of Star Wars things in my loft. But then there was another time, a few years later, where I had to do another clear out of stuff, because now was the time when we were going to say goodbye to one of my children. And the next picture will show you Ali's box. Ali is my youngest son, and he was moving off to Australia to live with his wife. He'd got married, and they were going to live in Australia, in Melbourne, so quite a distance from where Nathan lives, quite a lot of hours from where Nathan lives. And he was going to go and live there near to her family. And he had a whole load of things stored away in the loft since he got married, as indeed all our children had. So I had another sort out of whose stuff belonged to one child and who belonged to another, and said to them, listen, this is the time where you've got to sort out what you want to take on to your new homes and what mum and dad are going to throw away because we can't store them any longer. And Ali found in his box a huge, great bottle of marbles. He used to love collecting marbles. And every Saturday when he had his pocket money as a little boy, we'd go down to this amazing shop, the World of Marbles, and he would buy marbles of every sort and shape and size. And he had this huge jar, about this tall, full of marbles. And then he had his friend's box set and all the other things that were there, part of his thing, school books and school reports as well. And he had to decide what he wanted to transport to Australia, where his new home was, again recognising he had to squeeze into a suitcase. What mum was going to still carry on looking after, and what had to be thrown. And the marbles were just too heavy to carry, so I inherited the marbles, and my grandkids love playing with his marbles now, and he's thrilled to pass them on. So Ali had his box of memories as well. But you know, in life, we collect stuff ourselves, don't we? And I've got a few things there on a picture of my memories. I wasn't very organised. Having said I'm very good at clearing out cupboards, I wasn't very organised with photographs, and they used to just go in boxes. So I have got several boxes of photographs, which one day, when I have a few minutes to myself, we all say that, I'm going to sit down and actually sort out which photographs belong to who and try and put some albums together. On a wet, rainy day, I'm going to try and do that. But I've got lots of memories of old photographs, and that's an old picture of us with 3 of our lads, and then with me, with my grandchildren. They're a little bit bigger than that now. And we build memories, don't we? In fact, my children bought me, and I frantically tried to find it to bring it with me today. I must have cleared it out in one of my clear-outs, but I put it away safely somewhere, and I can't remember where. But it was a jar that had memories written on the side with a cork stopper. Because my kids knew that there were things that happened in life. Okay, you may have a photograph, but many times we don't, do we? We just have them as memories. Things that happen, wonderful times when we watch our children doing something funny or doing something really clever, or our grandchildren or other people, memories of things that go on. And we're storing memories all the time in our journey. And they refer to Mum's memory jar and say, those are the sort of places where you'd love to put something, literally physically put it into a jar, and then maybe another time pull it out and have a good look at it again. And then we find ourselves looking at photo albums at home. Well, this is the prelude, really, to this story that we've just read in Joshua. And it goes over several chapters, and I got Karen to read one of the chapters that's coming towards the end of the event. But I don't know whether you're familiar with the story of Moses. Moses had been called by God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, where they were in captivity. And because of disobedience, instead of a journey that could have just taken a few weeks, it took them 40 years in the desert because of disobedience. And God said to Moses very clearly, because of the disobedience, you're not going to be the one that's going to take them just out of Egypt and take them into the promised land, Canaan. There's going to be other people that will do that. So many of the people that came out of Egypt who'd been slaves and remembered those days actually died during the time that they were in the desert. And we come to the story at the beginning of Joshua when Moses has died. They're at the edge of the Jordan River. They're about to go into the promised land. And Moses is dead, but Joshua has been asked to take the people of Israel into the promised land over Jordan. So there are many people who are, during that journey, had talked about that wonderful miracle that it refers to in that passage that Karen read, about when God did something really, really amazing and the Red Sea was parted and the people of Israel were able to cross over this massive Red Sea onto dry land. They did an amazing miracle. And actually the people don't realise, but while they're queuing up waiting to cross the River Jordan, God's going to do something very similar again. Many of them had talked about it with their mums and their grandparents. But here they are, 40 years on, ready to cross the Jordan River. But there are some very specific instructions that are given, and they're given at the beginning of Joshua. If you have a chance to read the story, it's amazing. But at the beginning of Joshua chapter 1, after the death of Moses, Joshua is asked to lead the people of Israel across. And God gives him that word, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law. And then he says to Joshua in chapter 1, between 1 and 9, some very specific instructions about what they're to do before they cross the Jordan. And he says several things. First thing is, you need to consecrate yourselves. You need to prepare yourself, because this is a holy moment when you actually enter the promised land. The thing that was promised to your families 40 years previously, this is going to actually happen. You need to consecrate yourselves. You need to make yourselves ready. So there were rituals that they had to go through to do that. Then God said this specific thing, the Ark of the Covenant and the priests, they were the ones that had to lead into the Jordan. Now, I've been to the Jordan River. I had a chance to go to Israel, and I'm sure there are some wider parts, but it doesn't look a very overwhelming river, really. But this was not in the time of drought like we are. There are rivers near us that are like little tiny streams, and some of them are not even streams at all, which normally are quite fast-flowing rivers. And we see pictures, don't we, with all the droughts in the north of England of places in the Lake District that normally are very high and are completely dried out and cracked. Well, this was the flood season for the Jordan River, so actually it was pretty high and pretty scary. And the priests were going to have to step into the river with the Ark of the Covenant, and all the people had to be behind them. That was the second instruction. They were to do that. And then God said, the River Jordan's going to part. Now, some of them will probably think, well, I remember that happened at the Red Sea because my mum and dad told me about that, or my grandparents talked about how amazing that was. But I've never seen it, and this is scary. This is a fast-flowing river, and I'm not sure of very good swimming, and there's a lot of us. There's thousands of people. But the River Jordan will part. And then God said, I want you to choose 12 men, one from each of the tribes of Israel, and when they get to the centre of the river, they're not to sprint across, they're to pick up 12 large stones and to take them across the river. And then the last instruction was, all of you are to cross and go and camp at Gilgal. And there I want you to build an altar with the 12 stones. And Joshua says this to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. So they had very specific instructions that they had to do in crossing. And the miracle is, when you read the story, that's exactly what happened. And I mean, sometimes when we're familiar, maybe you are familiar with this passage, you don't really think about what's behind it. But I could imagine families thinking, I've got 10 children, or I've got a whole family of aunts and uncles, I've got people who are struggling to walk. I've got to get them into fast-flowing river, and I've got to get them across, and get them across safely. And there must have been a lot of nervous tension, worry, concern about how this was going to happen. Well, we know this story happened before, but, could God do that again? Would that really happen for us? Lots and lots of questions. But they did exactly what God had said. And as the priests stepped into the river, that flood water just banked back and made a way through for people to cross. And we read that and think, wow, but, that must have been, wow. Can you imagine how that must have felt when you'd stood and thought, God's done it again. We heard about this and he's done it again. And then those who thought, well, is that going to just come down as I'm halfway across? How are we going to get everybody across? There are hundreds of people to get across. But when they did get across, and then the 12 men came out with the stones and the priest stepped out of the river, everything started to flow again. And then they go off to Gilgal to build their altar. The next slide will show you some of those stories must have been told over and over again. Can you imagine those descendants who now walked into the promised land that God promised to their parents and their grandparents, telling that story? And it says there, you know, when your children say, what does that pile of stones mean? You can tell them exactly what happened. Because we do need things to remember. Our forgetteries are very good. Our memories are not so good. And we often need things to remind us. And I think, to me, this story challenges me on two fronts. About living the life that testifies to what God's done. I love to hear testimonies. It was great to hear Nathan's testimony today. I love to hear people's stories. One of the great privileges about being at college, and Nathan didn't say, but his brother actually went to Moorlands College, and I remember James. But one of the great things I love is hearing some of the students' stories, the journeys they've been on, the sort of things that have happened in their life that has brought them to the point where they became a Christian, and now they want to train in order to serve God. Just amazing. And we've got people not just who've just come from school. We've got people, one of our oldest students was 72. And Tony had been in the army through his life. He'd been serving in the army in all sorts of difficult places in Northern Ireland, Iraq. And he said at the end of his 3 years at college, he said, "Do you know what? Nothing in the army prepared me for how scared I was being part of Moorlands." And I need to explain that, because he said, I suddenly found lots of young people who challenged me, challenged my life, because they loved Jesus more than I did. I'd been a Christian for quite a few years, but there were people in their early 20s who'd gone through some incredible things in their life and really testified and witnessed to God. And he said, and they were sometimes having to challenge me about the things that I did. And he had to go and find help about how to use his computer and how to write essays, because they knew better than he did. He said that was more scary sometimes, relying on people who were so much younger than me. But I love to hear the stories of how people have come to know Jesus and what's gone on in their life. And it's such an important thing that we live the life. We live the life, and we live differently. So that when our children say to us, why do you do that? I can remember I grew up in a Christian household, and so did Ian. But my parents were first generation Christians. They didn't have Christian parents. And they grew up in a church that was great and supported them. But they will admit that they had to make a lot of mistakes as parents, because they had no real opportunity to look at what a Christian family was about, because they came from a non-Christian family. And we found the same, that there were things that we said, we're going to do this because as Christians this is what we believe we should do. And sometimes our children would say, why do we do that? And we had to think through, well, this is the reason, this is the principle. I had many discussions with my kids, because I grew up a bit like Jan in a Brethren assembly where you wore your best clothes when you went to church, and they were wanting to go to church in their jeans and scruffy t-shirt. And I can remember having a big debate. It was always happened on a Sunday when they walked down dressed in their old clothes, ready to go to church. I'd say, can you not put something on that's a bit cleaner and tidier? And one of my children said to me, Mum, wouldn't you just be glad that I've gone to church? Why are you challenging me about what you're wearing? And I felt really rebuked, and I said, you know, you're absolutely right. Why have I made such a big thing about what you're wearing? But it would be nice if you wore a clean pair of jeans, that you haven't been playing football through the week and whatever. And we had to come to a compromise. But sometimes questions are good, aren't they, when our families say to us, why do you do that? Why is that important to you? And sometimes our lives need to challenge people around us. Why do we make a commitment about doing things? And there's been many conversations with our kids about why we think it's important that we give money to our offering each week, why we think it's important that we pray over major decisions in our lives, why we put aside things in our lives and say that's something we won't do at the moment because we really believe God's calling us in this way. We need to live the life in order for our people around us and our children to ask those questions. Not what do those stones mean, but why do you do that? Why is the Bible so important to you? Why do you pray about those things? Our lives should be like that. They should raise questions in terms of what we're doing. Because if we're no different from anybody around, then those questions will not get raised. So we need to live the life. And there's a verse in Deuteronomy. It says, fix these words of mine on your hearts. Get them deep inside. That's the message. And that's why I think reading the Bible is so important, because that's the principles that we live on. That's why we live the way we do, reading the Bible and getting those things deep in our lives. So living the life is really important, so that I'm involved now looking after grandchildren. And it's very often the questions, especially when you're driving along in a car, that they'll ask you really deep questions. And it's a great opportunity with another generation to say, this is what Grandma and Granddad believe. This is why we do this. We've had questions about animals in heaven and all sorts of things that have just happened because they're asking the questions, and that's an important thing. And the last thing I've got there is passing it on. Perhaps when I'm getting older, maybe it's because you start to think about what life lies ahead of you. Nathan talked about what lies behind, and then he talked about what lies ahead. Well, what lies ahead, God willing for him, is many, many years. But we recognise as we get older that there are less years ahead than there are behind. And that's the reality of life, isn't it? And when we're grandparents, or even as parents, we think in terms of what we want to leave behind for our family. I'm sure the marbles will be one of the things from the loft, but there'll be other things that we're thinking about in terms of finance and security. Maybe for my mother-in-law, as she was getting older, she wanted to pass on some jewellery to me while I was still alive. While she was still alive, I should say, rather than wait until she died. So she passed on her engagement ring to me. So there's some things that we start to think on. And we think about those sort of things, but we also should be thinking about what we want to pass on in terms of our faith, what we believe. We want to be able to pass those on as well. I remember Ian's mum died when she was 93. She'd been on her own. Her husband had died 25 years previously. He died quite young. And I remember on her 90th birthday, we had done a tea for her and gathered all the family together. And we just said, Mum, would you like to say something? Now, I didn't have any means of recording it. I wished I could have recorded it, but actually I've recorded it a lot in my mind. She spent about 15, 20 minutes talking to the family, some of whom were not Christians, about the faithfulness of God through her life, what had happened through her life. It was just amazing. We had literally landed it on her, so she hadn't planned it, she hadn't prepared anything, but she just shared her testimony. And I can remember the four lads who were teenagers really at the time, just afterwards reeling really with recognising that there were some things that she talked about that she had never shared, but just passing on the faithfulness of God. And I thought, isn't that a wonderful thing that they can remember? And we waited until she was 90 to be able to do that. But we need to be able to, and there's a verse there in Psalms, says, one generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. That's our responsibility. It's a privilege, but it's also our responsibility as Christians to be able to pass on to another generation what God's done in our lives and how he can help us. So I guess the question I'm asking this morning, as I think about how we can put things in place to raise those questions, they're often part of our lives. Are we living a life that does raise questions? Are there things that we do, and we can express why we do them, that would raise a question for other people, not necessarily our families, but people that we work with? And when they do raise those questions, what does that mean? Are we prepared to give that answer? And are we seeing it as a responsibility that we should be able to pass on what God's done in our lives? Because when he's done some amazing things, it's great to be able to pass them on. I was telling Jan today that one of our boys married a girl who came from a non-Christian background, and she was an only child. And she used to spend the first few meals with us, when there was a lot of chat and banter going on, running out of the room and bursting into tears. And I thought, I don't think my family are that bad. Why is she doing it? And I asked her, and she said, I'm just not used to conversations. Being an only child, things were very sort of quiet around a meal, and we didn't tease each other. There wasn't that sort of banter, and there wasn't the memories. So, often when we get together as a family, and, we really relish those times as now, obviously people are living in different parts of the world. When they get together, they have a great way of recalling things that happened. We have a rule: if it's happened more than 7 years ago, you can't be punished for anything. You can't have to serve time for anything that you've done if it's more than 7 years ago. And they love to tell you stories of things that they brothers knew that went on, but I had no idea about at all. And for Hannah, this was so new. She just hadn't grown up with this. I mean, she's as bad as they are now. She's been married to my son for 6 years. But it was recognised, but also she didn't come from a Christian family. So there's a lot of questions she comes up with. She's become a Christian through the church that she's been attending, and is part of the worship band. She's got a lovely voice and she sings. But she still now and again comes out with questions that you sort of make your hair curl, and you say, well, let me explain, that's why we do this, because she hasn't got that background. But it's wonderful, because now as a couple they're able to put things into their 2 children's lives in terms of passing on. It's our responsibility, it's a privilege that we have to be able to pass it on. So what are you doing in terms of living your life and passing on what God's done in your life? And sometimes it's just a testimony of how God has saved you. Such an important thing that we can share together, of how God met us. And that's the challenge for all of us, that we have a responsibility to living the life. So like the Israelites, I looked up actually, I don't think that pile of stones is at Gilgal anymore. But they were good at doing things like that. Lots of places that the Israelites went, they built a pile of stones to remember. And a few months ago, I was doing chapel at college, and we decided to look a little bit at this passage. And we got I asked some of the students in my tutor group to just pick up 2 or 3 stones to start a little building at the front on the platform at the chapel. And people could go up and pick a stone and put it on and just say thank you to God, or I remember God for what you've done, a testimony for what you've done. And then I made them put them all back on the rockery afterwards, before the gardener came and got us into trouble. But, they were good at doing things like that. And sometimes people need to have a place to go, don't they? Somewhere to remind them of what God's done. And it may be that you've collected. I brought my newer Bible with me today. My old Bible is stashed with little things that I've written down, little cards that people have given me, times that God's really blessed me, in order to be able to remember, because my forgettery is getting so much worse. So let's pray. Father, thank you for reminding us that you did a great miracle for the people of Israel when you took them into the promised land, something that they had dreamt about for so many years, and finally crossing over to Jordan. What a miracle that was as you took them into the promised land. Thank you, you've done things in our lives. Lord, we may not have seen amazing miracles like rivers being closed up so they could walk across, but we have seen you touch our lives. We've seen you provide for us. Sometimes when we've been in real need, you've given us money and things and people. You've answered prayer. Lord, help us to remind ourselves of those so that we can pass that on to others, how good you are. You are a good God. That's who you are. And we are loved by you. That's who we are. Thank you that we can live differently and that we can testify to what you've done in our lives. Help us to do that even this week, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.